Thank you so much, Lisa and Consilium, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here today. My disclosure is that I'm a paid expert witness at the request of plaintiffs in litigation regarding pharmaceutical and medical device marketing practices. So I'm talking today about how pharmaceutical companies invent diseases in order to sell drugs. But I want to make it clear that we're not against drugs. Drugs are a great thing. There are many drugs that are overused, but there's also many drugs that are underused. And they can save lives and improve health when they're used appropriately. So what we're against at Farmed Out is the inappropriate use of drugs and the inappropriate promotion of drugs, particularly, especially when it affects the education of physicians, other healthcare providers, and consumers. So pharmaceutical companies over promote drugs for many conditions, and in some cases they adopt or co-opt conditions, and in other cases just invent them completely. Sometimes they'll take a symptom and make it into a disease. They'll take a risk factor and make that into a disease, or a personality trait, or just normal human variability. And you can see that the number of diseases in the International Classification of Diseases has really gone up over the years, and especially in the last 25 or 30 years, there's been this huge increase in the number of things that are considered diseases. So many things have been subdivided. So there's many different flavors of depression, for example, nowadays. And this is from an article by Bjorn Hoffman in Norway, who's done really excellent work on the expansion of diseases. So marketing a drug actually starts a long time before the drug is introduced into the market. It can start 7 to 10 years before a drug comes on the market. And in the US and in other countries as well, it's illegal to market a drug. It's illegal for a pharmaceutical company to market a drug before it's on the market. But it's not illegal to market the disease. And in the United States, we actually have direct-to-consumer advertising, which is illegal in every other country except for New Zealand. But from reading from reading drug company literature, we know that if you live in a country where they don't allow direct-to-consumer advertising, they still allow the promotion of diseases because it's considered education. So anyway, so the disease mongering, if you will, or the selling sickness happens it can start 7 to 10 years before a drug comes on the market, and it might be emphasizing the severity of a disease or a condition that wasn't considered important before, or it might be emphasizing problems of therapies that are already on the market. But often what this marketing is about is what we call the tragic epidemic. There's something that you may not have thought was particularly serious, or you may not have thought was particularly common, and really it's much more widespread than you may think. So these marketing messages before a drug is on the market, or even after the drug is on the market in some places, will focus on how a particular condition is underdiagnosed, it's widespread, it has a tragic effect on life, and perhaps how current treatments are either they don't exist, or they're inadequate, or they're problematic. So this is from an article by Deuce showing that when you expand the number of people who are eligible for a diagnosis, of course, you're expanding the number of people who are eligible for a drug. And there have been many cases in which the standards for what constitutes a disease change over time. So when I was in medical school, a blood pressure of 120 over 80 was considered perfect, and now it's considered pre-hypertension. So there's a lot of pre's nowadays too: pre-hypertension, pre-diabetes, osteopenia instead of osteoporosis, for example. But once you expand the diagnosis, once you change the criteria for diagnosis, you have vastly expanded the number of people who are now eligible for a drug. And this is true in many different circumstances. For example, in 1998, in the US, the standards for what constitutes overweight and obesity were changed by a group that was rife with conflict of interest. And overnight, 37 million people became overweight or obese simply based on a new definition of those categories. So pharmaceutical companies fund many educational campaigns, both to healthcare providers and to consumers. And these campaigns are meant to expand these populations that are eligible for treatment and also make sure that the newest and most expensive drugs are the ones that healthcare providers know the most about. So there's a term that's used in industry called condition branding, the deliberate management of patient, physician, payer, and other stakeholder knowledge about a condition in order to improve how the condition is treated. That could really be translated as in order to get the categories of people to either prescribe, use, or pay for a particular therapy. And in condition branding, you're generally trying to link one particular condition with one particular therapy. So there's different ways of doing condition branding. You might be elevating the importance of an existing condition. So I think psoriasis would be a good example of that. Garden variety psoriasis is now treated with very potent immunosuppressant drugs. And in order to make it acceptable to use these very potent drugs, you have to elevate the importance of the underlying condition, often by linking it, for example, with psoriatic arthritis, which is much less common than garden variety psoriasis. You might redefine an existing condition to reduce the stigma. And a great example of that would be erectile dysfunction. So some of the audience may be old enough to remember when we call that condition impotence. And it was redefined by the makers of Viagra as erectile dysfunction, or you could call it ED, in order to reduce the stigma and brand that term with Viagra. And then the third way is to develop a new condition, to build recognition for an unmet marketing need. And that's really just creating a condition often out of a symptom or a collection of symptoms. And perhaps one of the first examples of condition branding was done by Arthur Sackler. So you might know the Sackler name, which is connected with OxyContin, a very important player in the opioid epidemic that we have in the US, and actually the same techniques that were used to sell opioids in the US are now being used to sell opioids in other countries, mainly by emphasizing the undertreatment of chronic pain. Anyway, when Arthur Sackler was not around, he had died before OxyContin came out, but really his contribution to selling drugs was much more broad. He was a really brilliant medical marketer. He was a physician, but also really he's in the medical advertising. I think he was the first person to be in the Medical Advertising Hall of Fame for the techniques that he developed. He really pioneered the use of education to advertise drugs for physicians. He started the first data mining company to collect information on prescribers. And he consulted with different pharmaceutical companies, one of which was Roche Pharmaceuticals. They had an anxiolytic drug, Librium, and then they came out with another anxiolytic drug, Valium, and they didn't want the sales of Valium to interfere with the sales of Librium. So the idea that Arthur Sackler came up with was that Librium would be sold for generalized anxiety disorder, but Valium would be sold for something different, psychic tension. And psychic tension was the stress that someone felt when they got married or went away to college or moved, sort of normal life stresses. And this was called psychic tension to differentiate it from generalized anxiety disorder. And Valium was the first drug to reach $100 million in sales. It was the first drug to become a blockbuster drug. So here's an ad for Valium, the 35-year-old single and psychoneurotic patient. Valium can be a useful adjunct in the therapy of the tense, overanxious patient who has a neurotic sense of failure, guilt, or loss. So you can see how this would really expand the population of people who would be eligible for this drug. These are just some of the conditions that have been created or co-opted by pharmaceutical companies. And I'm not going to cover all of these today, but I'm happy to I'm happy to talk about any of them during the Q&A um, uh, part of this. I just want to mention with pediatric bipolar disorder, when I was in medical training, we were taught that bipolar disorder started in people in their 20s. But in order to expand the use of antipsychotics, pharmaceutical company used key opinion leaders, influencers, to create the idea that children, even 2-year-olds, might be happy one minute and crying the next, pretty much your job description if you're a 2-year-old, and that was rapid cycling mood disorder. And potent combinations of antipsychotics were actually used in small children, including children as young as under a year old. And some of these children died from these drugs. Here's an example of condition branding. Prozac or fluoxetine was an important antidepressant and was a much safer antidepressant than previous ones when it came on the market. But when market exclusivity started to come to an end in the years before that, the company took premenstrual syndrome and they made it into a new disorder, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So this was like premenstrual syndrome on steroids. This was a terrible condition that was ruining women's lives. And then they sold the exact same drug in the exact same dose, fluoxetine 20 milligrams, but it was in a different color pill. They named it Seraphim and they sold it for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. By the way, Seraphim, I think, is one of my favorite drug names. Drug companies will often pay a vendor a lot of money to come up with a great name. And Sarah, of course, is a woman's name. Femme is feminine, and seraphim is a homophone for SERAPHIM, which means angels. So this drug makes you angelic. Paxil or paroxetine was a serotonin reuptake inhibitor that was pretty late to market. So after the success of Prozac, many companies came up with their SSRI version, but Paxil was pretty late to market. And so they weren't going to have much of a market share. So they created a new disorder that really what we used to call shyness, and they recast it as social anxiety disorder. And that was an example of condition branding for a specific drug, Paxil. Another condition that was co-opted and really exaggerated by drug companies was GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disorder. So this is what we used to call heartburn, and we used to tell patients, don't eat so much, don't drink so much alcohol, cut down on caffeine, don't eat right before going to bed, take calcium carbonate tablets. And when H2 blockers came out, when other drugs came out, like these were actually these are quite effective for treating heartburn and for treating ulcers as well. But the trouble with heartburn is people only have it once in a while. And in order to get people to take a drug every day for the rest of their lives, which obviously makes a lot more profits than just taking them after a big holiday meal, this company created the concept of gastroesophageal reflux disorder, and they created an Institute for Digestive Health to raise the bar of seriousness, to get people to really take this seriously so that they would be willing to take a drug every day for the rest of their lives. And that really worked to establish this. These drugs, by the way, cause a withdrawal syndrome. So if someone stops them, they get a rebound heartburn, which may convince them that they need to keep taking the drug for the rest of their lives. This is a disease, if you will, that that I probably have, binge eating disorder. And binge eating, not to make light of it as a symptom, binge eating is a problem. Binge eating can It can be a manifestation of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, many other psychiatric conditions. But is it really a disease on its own, binge eating disorder? Especially when you look at this definition, which, like I said, I think I would fit. Regularly eating far more food than most people would in a similar time period under similar circumstances. Well, I'm sorry, some of us just have a bigger appetite than the rest of you. And the instances must take place at least once a week for 3 months. So you can see that this would really expand the number of people who might think that they actually have this disorder. Severe underarm sweating is also a disease. Injecting Botox under the arms will decrease sweating. And you can see that this educational campaign would be, well, if the condition isn't adequately managed by topical medicines, then it's a medical condition. It should be treated. Here's another ad for severe underarm sweating. Pseudobulbar affect is a condition that wasn't created by pharmaceutical companies. It is a real condition when people have an injury to a part of their brain. They can have really inappropriate laughing or crying. They'll be might burst out laughing at a funeral. They might start crying at a joke or in an inappropriate situation. But what the company that wanted to sell Nuedexta did was they expanded this diagnosis to include many more people. You in fact may be a sufferer. So they linked it with many different neurologic conditions, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain disorder, Parkinson's disease, and stroke, but didn't even limit it to people with these neurologic conditions. Here's a pseudobulbar affect test that was available online. Others have told me that I seem to become amused very easily, or that I seem to become amused about things that really aren't funny. There are times when I won't be thinking of anything happy or funny at all, but will suddenly be overcome by funny or happy thoughts. We just for fun, we gave this test to everyone who walked into my office over a period of a couple of days. I'd say that most of the people that we gave this test to failed this test. So it's a way of expanding the population that's eligible for a drug. The Nuedexta was actually a combination of two old, inexpensive drugs, dextromethorphan and quinidine. So these were two old generic drugs, but put together cost quite a lot more money. Another disease that was created by industry is hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which is really the daughter, if you will, of female sexual dysfunction, which was also created by industry. HSDD was created in 2004, characterized by persistently or recurrently deficient or absent sexual fantasies and desire for sexual activity that causes market distress or, note, interpersonal difficulty. So even if a woman is perfectly happy with her level of libido, if her partner is not happy, she can still be diagnosed with this condition. And the creation of female sexual dysfunction and HSDD has been very well documented in this wonderful book. And there have been many articles that have been written about this by Ray Moynihan and Leonore Tiefer and Barbara Mincies. It's been very well documented. Of course, there's no scientifically validated norm for what is actually normal in sexual activity or feelings of desire, and decreased interest in sex can be due to a lot of things, including relationship problems and medication, ironically. And in cases where none of this is a problem, psychologic treatments have been shown to be effective. So some students and I did a project where we looked at marketing messages in continuing medical education and other materials on HSDD. And we sort of reverse engineer these marketing messages. Every drug that comes on the market has 10 to 20 marketing messages that are created to go with it. So it's the tragic epidemic. Women may not even be aware that they're sick. Simple questionnaires can aid diagnosis. There's often the simple online questionnaire. And in order to to advantage of this a drug called flibanserin or Addy in the U.S. There also was a campaign saying that the FDA was sexist because it had approved all these drugs for men's sexual problems, but not women. And it was a very imperfect comparison because the FDA had actually never approved a drug to improve libido in men. But one of my, I love these online tests, but one of my, this was actually a test that physicians were supposed to use to diagnose HSDD in women. And this is my favorite question from the Female Sexual Function Index. Also, it doesn't have a scoring system, so you can pass or fail anyone. But my favorite question is, over the past 4 weeks, how often did you feel sexual desire or interest? And if you said that you felt sexual desire or interest, if the patient said she felt sexual desire or interest 50% of the time, 50% of her waking hours, she would only score a 3 out of 5. In order to score a 5 on this question, you would have to say that you felt sexual desire or interest all or almost all of the time. And this is an article that we wrote about the marketing messages to sell HSDD. So this is another example that I would like to think was an historic example, but unfortunately it's not because it's all coming back now. But the idea that menopause was a disease or disabling condition in women is quite old. And it was really created to sell hormones. So in 1942, Wyeth released Premarin, a conjugated equine estrogens. The name actually tells you where it's from. Premarin stands for pregnant mare's urine. And they pretty immediately started to link the idea that estrogen was the key to youthfulness and beauty and vigor. Every woman who suffers from estrogen disease deserves Premarin. Here's a 1957 ad. And Wyeth, later Heirst, then Wyeth Heirst, and then Wyeth, and then Pfizer. There were a lot of buying and selling of companies. In the 1950s, Heirst, which had Premarin, they started this program to educate physicians and patients about menopause, vasomotor symptoms, which are hot flashes and night sweats, atrophic vaginitis, and this was all to help to sell Premarin. Also, good for the whole family. Difficult family situations can often be wholly remedied by estrogen therapy for the women involved. That was a quote from Robert Wilson, who wrote a book, Feminine Forever. He was being funded by hormone manufacturers. This is a really terrible book, which called Menopausal Women and Intersex, among other things. It's a 1968 ad. And another one from 1968. So Robert Wilson had the Wilson Foundation, received a lot of money from pharmaceutical companies. No woman can be sure of escaping the horror of this living decay. So very insulting characterizations of menopausal women. And by the way, not only saying that it would restore youth, health, and beauty, but also tractability. It would make women easier to live with if they were on estrogen. At some point, they actually sold a combination of estrogen and a tranquilizer. And there were concerns even back in the 60s that estrogen increased the risk of breast cancer and other cancers. And in his book and in his writings, Robert Wilson said that these were entirely false. In the contrary, indications are that estrogen acts as a cancer preventive. So that particular lie has really lasted over time. So estrogen was approved as a drug. It was promoted as an anti-aging treatment. And then in the mid-70s, a series of studies came out showing that estrogen increased the risk of endometrial cancer, of uterine cancer. And that plummeted sales of estrogen. Around the same time, the NIH held a consensus conference that showed that the only symptoms that were associated with menopause were hot flashes and night sweats and vaginal dryness, and estrogen is actually helpful for those conditions. So sales of estrogen plummeted, but then a new form of hormones came back out in the 1980s is an estrogen-progestin combination. So when a progestin is added to estrogen, it mitigates the estrogen-induced increase in endometrial cancer. And so this estrogen progestin was released in the 1980s, and now it was being promoted as a disease preventive. So not just attractiveness, but disease prevention and health promotion. These are claims that were made very widely in the 80s and 90s. Not only would hormone replacement therapy keep you young, but it would prevent heart attacks and stroke and dementia and loss of memory and incontinence and depression and anxiety. It was just like a tonic. It was just good for anything, anything that ailed you. It would prevent a lot of chronic disease. So here's an ad from this time that shows all of the different organs that hormone therapy was supposed to help. So the company that made Premarin and Prempro hired a pharma vendor called Design Right, and there are many medical education companies that do meetings for pharmaceutical companies. They may help them with publications. These publications may be ghost written or ghost managed, meaning that the author whose name decorates the paper may actually have contributed to it. But anyway, in their so Design Right was hired by Wyeth, and in their proposal, they stated HRT continues to be a drug in search of a disease, and that we need to be marketing it as a prevention for Alzheimer's and colon cancer and cardiovascular risks and osteoporosis. And one of their objectives for their publication plan in 1997 was not only to educate physicians about all of the benefits of hormone therapy, but also diminish the negative perceptions associated with estrogens and cancer. Because by 1997, there had been many observational studies that had linked hormone therapy to breast cancer. So they did many educational things, but one of the things that they did was they bought a medical journal supplement and mailed it out to a huge number of physicians in the United States. And these were the messages these are quotes from what was in the supplement, because it was really meant to reassure physicians that there was a lot of doubt around the connection between hormones and breast cancer. If there is an increased risk of breast cancer associated with the use of estrogen replacement therapy or hormone replacement therapy, this risk must be small. Recent studies continue the pattern of inconsistency in research on this topic. So this is messaging to reassure physicians that they didn't need to worry about adverse effects from HRT. And in the 2000s, there was still a lot of money being spent on expanding the definition of menopause, and that this was a state of estrogen deficiency. It should be treated like diabetes, being a deficiency of insulin, or thyroid deficiency. It should just be treated the same way, and women needed to be put on estrogen. So there were observational studies that showed that women who took estrogen had less cardiovascular disease, et cetera, than women who didn't take estrogen, but those were observational studies. And due to activism from the women's health movement, actually, the NIH started a randomized controlled trial. First, there was a randomized controlled trial in women who had heart disease that showed no benefit of hormones for heart disease. And then there was the Women's Health Initiative, which took many women who did not have a history of heart disease, a great just cross-section of the population, and randomized them to receive estrogen progestin if they had a uterus, estrogen only if they didn't have a uterus, or placebo over many years. The estrogen progestin arm was stopped early because there was an increased risk of breast cancer, cardiovascular disease, and harm in the treated group. Later, the estrogen-only arm was also halted because of increased strokes and an absence of cardiovascular benefit. Later analyses showed that estrogen progestin increased the risk of blood clots and dementia. So this really blew the idea out of the water that hormones actually benefited health. They actually were harmful to health. So hormone therapy was claimed to prevent cardiovascular disease, dementia, incontinence. It actually increased strokes, did not prevent cardiovascular disease, may have increased it, doubled the risk of dementia, increased incontinence. So many of the things that it was promoted to help it actually hurt. And this article here is an analysis of how articles in medical journals were used to promote marketing messages to physicians about hormones. Even though there had been all these marketing messages reassuring physicians about breast cancer, the risk of breast cancer with hormones, the Women's Health Initiative actually found that breast cancers associated with hormone therapy were worse breast cancers and more likely it to be associated with death. So after the Women's Health Initiative came out, I mean, hormones weren't just being used in the US. They were being used in about 1 out of 5 menopausal women in the US, but they were also being used all over the world. And after the results of the Women's Health Initiative came out, hormone prescriptions plummeted around the world, and breast cancer rates also dropped phenomenally in every cancer registry in the world that was tracking them. So, like I said, I thought this would be, sort of usually I've been presenting this over the last few years as this is, historical, this story about menopause and hormone therapy, and now we know the truth about it, but it's all starting up again. This has all the hallmarks of a pre-launch marketing campaign for hormones. And there have been many articles in the literature, in the media, mainly about the stigma of menopause and how women don't talk about it, and it causes all of these symptoms, and there's all these myths about hormone therapy. So here's 10 symptoms of menopause: dry eyes, who knew? Dry skin, weight gain. We'd love to blame that on something. Hair loss, depression. There's not 10 symptoms. Maybe there's 38 symptoms of the menopause. Altered skin sensation, whatever that means. Joint pains, hair changes, brain fog, breathing difficulties, burning mouth, body odor. So all of these things are being connected with menopause, and none of them are actually associated with menopause. Here's even more things: brittle nails, dizziness, itchy skin, all kinds of things. So some things are symptoms of aging, some things are symptoms of life, some things are just normal human variability, but they're all being thrown into the menopause category at the moment. I'm sure this is getting ready to sell something. Here's the National Menopause Foundation funded by Astellas. Many different things, being electric shocks. Look at what was being promoted in Feminine Forever and in Wyeth's campaign way back when. Wilson claimed that menopause caused heart disease and strokes and osteoporosis and bad skin, depression, irritability, even suicide. Like all this is all coming back as being attributed to menopause. The only two symptoms that are really associated with menopause are hot flashes and vaginal dryness. But menopause is being cast as a disabling condition. It's ruining women's careers. Menopause coaches are being recommended to businesses that women should be are allowed to talk about their menopausal symptoms at work, and companies need to hire menopause coaches to address this disability. It's really sort of, this is kind of the opposite of the perception of women that the women's movement has been after for many decades at this point. And there are just some other more examples of the supposed stigma around menopause and the many problems that are associated with it. And of course, this is all about selling hormones, maybe hormones that are currently on the market, maybe hormone combinations that are coming on the market. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to be actually of menopausal age to suffer from these different symptoms and to be eligible for treatment. Perimenopause can cause symptoms purportedly even in women in their 30s. So anything that is wrong with you can be blamed on hormones. So this is all about selling hormones again. So we thought we had gotten rid of the myths about menopause and hormone therapy 20 years ago, but it's all coming back, and not just in the US, but really around the world as well. So these are some examples, and it's really a huge problem. Industry is distorting medical discourse. They're distorting conversations among healthcare providers. They're distorting conversations among patients and between healthcare providers and patients. Physicians and other prescribers are most familiar with the most expensive, most promoted drugs and most expensive drugs, and they're not exposed to accurate information on older drugs, generic drugs, over-the-counter therapies, and non-pharmacologic therapies. So marketing diseases is actually more important than marketing drugs, and many diseases can be invented or redefined. I'm afraid we're in a situation where we've just stopped tolerating normal human variation. And please subscribe to our newsletter at farmedout.org. It comes out once a month. We also have a podcast, a monthly podcast called Farm Manipulation. And we have a lot of educational resources and other resources that are available at the Farmed Out site. So I'm going to end there, and happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adriane. So I would ask those of you who have questions to please turn on your camera and raise your hand so I can see you, invite you to the floor. I would very much appreciate if you ask questions verbally rather than putting them in the chat. But we do have a few questions in the chat, which I will read out to Adriane. But let's start with Peter. So please go ahead.
Adriane, that was fantastic. I've heard you speak many times and enjoyed collaborating with you for over a decade now. So thank you for this. Here's my question. And as the co-director of the Health and Public Interest Program at Georgetown, I know you know this. Health reflects the larger society. And sometimes making a problem bigger, to quote a number of sages who have said something like that, allows you to address it, perhaps not as a problem, but as a meta crisis or a polycrisis. Are there forces at work in the world that we who are concerned about the influence of pharmaceutical in the industry could be tapping into, that represent neoliberalism, that represent the dangers of capitalism in many, many other domains of life other than the important one of health? So thank you for sharing your any wisdom you might have on that question.
No, great comments, Peter. And yeah, I mean, what part of this also, reflects our dependence on professionals, our dependence on experts, our lack in the US, our lack of having a national health care system, and the fact that there's so much that we don't have a coherent healthcare system in the US. We have competing healthcare sectors, and that is never going to result in good healthcare for people. And of course, capitalism does contribute to that. And you can't just have competing healthcare sectors competing for profits and have that result in decent healthcare for people. So I could go on a rant about that, but I see there are other people who want to comment as well.
Thank you. Joanna, please go ahead with your question.
Wanted to ask if long COVID has become a victim of this disease mongering process. Somebody once said that the definition of this was to take the biggest possible prevalence of a condition and combine it with the worst possible case or the worst possible outcome, so that often I hear from, people who think they're citing science that 1 in 5 cases of COVID will lead to long COVID, and this can very well disable you for life. And any thoughts on that?
Interesting. There are definitely people who have troublesome symptoms and sometimes debilitating symptoms after COVID. I haven't looked into any possible exaggeration of that, but given that there are no specific therapies for it, it doesn't have the hallmarks of at least a pharma marketing campaign.
All right, so there is a question from Murad Khan, who's asking if all these are prescription-only drugs that you've been talking about in your presentation, then why do physicians prescribe them for artificially invented conditions?
Well, they don't know that they're invented conditions. They're taught about them in medical school. Many of their teachers are being paid by pharmaceutical companies, but it's also things trickle down. Like there are diseases that were invented for drugs that are no longer on the market, but the diseases are still there. So, I mean, unfortunately, because of the effect that pharmaceutical companies have on medical knowledge, many of these many false concepts are still being perpetuated and being taught and being learned by healthcare professionals who are not being paid by pharmaceutical companies. They're simply disseminating what they have already learned, and it's really a huge problem. I try and get medical students and other people sort of mad about this process because it's actually very burdensome for them to learn about all of these diseases that don't exist. And it would be a lot easier if we actually concentrated on real diseases and not made up diseases. It's the biggest problem. The biggest number of invented diseases is in psychiatry. So when you think about it, we have no objective tests for any psychiatric diagnoses. And if you look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Diagnoses, it's gotten bigger and bigger over time because there's many different flavors of depression, there's many different flavors of anxiety, et cetera. So it's become more and more complicated.
Your answer follows the next question, which is from Gina in the chat. So how do we get these invented diseases out of the medical school curricula?
Well, we need to get pharmaceutical companies out of educating medical students, educating other healthcare providers, but also really important, getting them out of continuing medical education. There should be a hard line between education and pharmaceutical companies, that there's been way too much blurring between the promotion of drugs and education about drugs. So most of the continuing medical education in the US, which most doctors have to take, and continuing medical education is required in many other countries as well. Most of the education that healthcare providers actually utilize is funded by pharmaceutical companies. It all has marketing messages in it, all of it. They may be very subtle, they may be hard to see, they may be positioning a drug that is going to come on the market in 10 years, but they all have marketing messages in them. So we need to make that, this is one of the major goals of Farmed Out, is to completely separate the education of healthcare providers from industry.
All right, thank you very much. Alan, you're back on your seat right on time, so please go ahead with your question.
Oh, great talk, Adriane. I just wanted to, so just for full disclosure, we wrote a book called Selling Sickness, which was basically on the topic that you talked about this morning. And this book came out almost 20 years ago, so in 2005. So I'm trying to look at the sort of what has happened over the last 20 years in terms of trying to wind back the corporate sponsored marketing of disease. And I'm trying to think, what are the main organizations in the world that are really kind of working and pushing back on this? And I can only think of a couple. And I wonder if you could perhaps comment from your perspective. I mean, you've got Farmed Out, we've got the Preventing Overdiagnosis conference, and it's a kind of a movement. You've got things like Choosing Wisely. But are there other sort of main groups that you think are really doing a substantial pushback on this?
Well, thanks for mentioning the book, Alan. You know, by Ray Moynihan, really a great book, and yeah, there has been a fair amount written, you know, over time on this, but you know, unfortunately, I think the problem has actually just gotten worse. And actually, many of the organizations that were doing some work on this have gone under. Just recently wrote an article about sort of the, you know, the organizations that are working no gratias, for example, and so there are different versions of the you know, doctors who are refusing no gratias is in Spain. There's other organizations of healthcare providers who are refusing to see drug reps or go to industry funded lunches. There are industry-free organizations like Health Action International and Transparamed and some other organizations that are doing some work on this, but we really need to have more. Many of these organizations are working on multiple issues, and on some of these issues, like continuing medical education, I think PharmDoubt's the only group that's we're working on continuing medical education. And in terms of working on inventing diseases, yeah, not much. So, but we have a lot of people on at this webinar, so I'm hoping that some of you will take up the take up some cudgels here.
Good. I have another question if nobody else does.
Yeah, please go ahead, Alan. Maybe you
So-
can have solutions as well.
So I've been really looking closely. Well, I have a fairly keen eye for where I think disease mongering is happening, and something that's been happening in Canada recently, and I don't know if it's happening in the US, and there seems to be a substantial push around measles. So as you know, measles is a vaccine preventable condition that most of us at my age would have had it as kids. We would have had developed some lifelong immunity, but stories in the mainstream press, the CBC, the Canada's Globe and Mail, you know, are depicting measles as being this sort of underdiagnosed, undertreated, widespread, tragic effects on health. All the kind of markers of if you're trying to sell a disease. And when I've looked into it, it seems to me, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a fair bit of massive exaggeration in terms of the severity and there were something like 7 cases of measles in Canada last year. I mean, this is it seems to me that there's something behind this, and I don't know if this is a pharma sponsored thing or just a public health are pushing this, but you know,
It's not a pharma sponsored thing, Alan. Measles is a highly transmissible and serious disease that we don't have much experience with because
most of us had
of the
I mean,
success of vaccinations against measles. Like most of us, you know, haven't seen it in our practice. But you know, it's a very serious disease, and I think that we cannot have enough of a public health push to try and, you know, make sure that the few cases that have been reported in various countries actually are, you know, give us warning about how important it is to vaccinate children against that disease. So that's a public health push, not a pharma push.
I'm just wondering why it's coming now when we've got 7 cases.
Because now we have
Canada.
cases because a lot of parents aren't vaccinating their kids against preventable childhood diseases.
Okay, well, I beg to differ, but anyways, we can argue this offline. But anyways, I'll move on to the next question there.
Thank you. John, please go ahead. Perhaps you're muted. All right, while John James is trying to sort out his...
Yeah, okay.
Now we
I
hear
didn't
you.
realize it was called on. I'm sorry. Adriane, so to what extent are medical journals culpable or responsible for this spread of misinformation about pseudo diseases? I think especially their advertisements. Do they vet these at all? Or if somebody comes along and got the money to advertise in a medical journal, they're going to allow it. Do you have an opinion or view about that?
Yeah, thanks, John. Medical journals they're contributing quite a lot to this problem, and unfortunately are really quite beholden to pharmaceutical advertising. So we wrote about this many years ago. I haven't written about it for a while, but medical journals only accept advertising from pharmaceutical companies almost exclusively, which is really kind of strange. You'd think there'd be lots of advertising of other products that would be of interest to physicians, but it really affects what they publish. And it's very open access journals that don't, like Public Library of Science journals, that don't accept advertising from industry are really important and are able to publish articles that are more critical. We have a lot of trouble getting our articles that are critical of industry published because most medical journals are taking money from pharmaceutical. They're afraid of losing pharmaceutical advertising, and in fact have lost pharmaceutical advertising when they published industry critical articles before. So major problem. And also there's a lot of conflict of interest among not only the authors of articles but also among medical journal editors. And there's other problems as well, like New England Journal of Medicine, very well thought of journal, doesn't even publish conflict of interest disclosures with their articles anymore. You have to like go on their website and search for them in order to even see what conflicts of interest are. So yes, major contributor.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Kim, please go ahead.
Hi, Adrienne. Thanks for another great presentation. I always are inspired by you. Anyways, how do you feel like, so, I've been going to these conferences from like Farmed Out, Selling Sickness to, preventing overdiagnosis for many years. And I feel like things have gotten worse, right? And I feel like in the system, which we're all operating with, pharma and influence the medical journals, et cetera, it doesn't seem like it's changing. It, in fact, seems like it's getting worse. So I believe that we got to start educating the lay public and getting more people to attend these things. Because, like myself and probably like John James on there, we all came into this because we got thrown into it because of something that happened to our family members, right? But, that's part of why we don't want what happens to us to happen to them, right? So how do you feel like we, as what you're teaching this group, how do we like bring that out to the mainstream public? How do we work with consumers that the everyday unsuspecting public goes in and they're going to be the ones that maybe it's not going to change from top down in the system, but we got to change and rise up and educate the person, the lay person, because ultimately we're the ones that will pay the price for all the things that we're learning. Because, like the HRT, I'm hearing that all the time now because I'm probably in that age group. And so what advice do you have to help, and where do you think it comes? Do you think it's going to come from like docuseries, the entertainment, to get people to care about this topic?
Well, first, like, don't give up. I mean, I love the idea that I actually know a fair number of the questioners and some of the people, who are watching here today, and people are doing really great work on this. And you never know what evils you're actually stopping by the work that you're doing or holding back, right? So we have made a difference. I agree that the problems are huge, and we need to educate both healthcare providers and consumers as well. But I've got kind of a hard answer for that, Kim, which is that what we really, as the consumers and those of us who are working with consumers, what we really need to do right now is to combat the industry funded consumer advocacy groups that have become even more important in the US and elsewhere at convincing legislators and regulators and the media to that ineffective or dangerous drugs should be approved or should stay on the market, and other therapies. But there are we have a small list that please help us update of groups in the North America that do not take industry money, consumer advocacy groups that do not take industry money. And I think we've got 14 groups on that. There are more than 7,000 groups in the US that do take money. And they're the ones who are, putting pathetic patients and pathetic families of patients in front of FDA advisory committee meetings, as you know, Kim, and other and in front of the media, in front of legislators saying, please approve this horrible drug, or please keep this horrible drug on the market. And they're very effective. So we really need to do battle with those groups. And that's very difficult. What we've run into with that is people saying, oh no, we don't want to stop public participation. And it's ill-informed industry bought public participation. I do want to stop.
Mhm. I think that's a good thing, because obviously I see it at the FDA all the time, these consumer groups and patient groups, and you're one. There's very few people out there. And I think it's because it's lack of money, right? And getting our message out. So, but I think you're right. We're going to have to fight that.
And it's not just, you don't need money to take a stand.
Yep. Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Adriane. So Andrew, please go ahead with your question.
Hi, thanks very much, Adriane. It's a really, really good presentation. And my question is that, if we have groups of people who believe they've got a condition, we have pharmaceutical companies, on the other hand, who see that as an opportunity to develop something that addresses what that group perceives they have as a need. Who should be the arbiter of whether something is really a condition or not? And if it is a condition that's worthy of the healthcare systems and the pharmaceutical industry investing their efforts to discover treatments for?
Yeah, it's such a great, that's such a great and really philosophical question. And do we actually need some kind of group that determines whether something is really a disease or not? Because as healthcare providers, we're used to treating uncomfortable symptoms, and uncomfortable symptoms should be treated, sometimes with prescription drugs. But where is who supplies the information that goes into those kinds of those kinds of decisions that we make between physicians and or other healthcare providers and patients? Who determines what really is a disease? I don't have a good answer for that, but I wonder whether we shouldn't actually have some objective panels that do this, because it's by the time something gets to a drug regulatory agency, I'm not sure it should be them who is making that decision, but they're the ones who are making the decisions about the therapies. But if you've got a therapy for something that isn't really a disease, so I don't know, but I think that's a question that everybody here should be thinking about. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. David, please, the floor is yours.
It's not only the FDA and the MHRA and NICE that have been bought, it's also the government. The government wants to make the UK a profitable place for pharma to invest, and they do it by persuading the MHRA to approve things prematurely, I think. And that sounds a bit conspiratorial, but there is some good evidence for it. There was a thing by Margaret McCartney, I think, recently to that effect. So you're not only fighting regulatory agencies, you're fighting the government as well.
Thank you. And we see, sometimes there may be active interest, and even when there isn't active interest, there's often I don't know, some kind of sort of naivete that we've seen in government agencies about that they just don't seem to be the least bit skeptical about partnering with industry in lots of situations in which they shouldn't be. But that's very interesting, and thank you, David. Love your work.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but I would like to ask one more question, Adriane, before we finish. When you were responding to Kim's question, you said maybe it's not necessarily the money that will make a difference, but doing something rather than nothing is important. But on the other hand, I also feel that there is a massive imbalance in terms of how much money goes from industry or from interested stakeholders. Well, they're all commercial, probably, into pushing their agenda, whether it's drug promotion, disease promotion, journals, whatever you say, and how completely unfunded are the organizations who are pushing against. And this is a very, very unequal war, because money, however unpleasant they might be, they can resolve a lot of things. And if somebody decided to push billions into the other side of the scale, who knows how the dialogue would go forward, who knows what kind of pressures could be put on the government, on the regulators. So how come we cannot find an interested party who would financially support this? Or is there even a chance, or the chance is only within money-making industrial complex?
Yeah, well, I mean, something that I've learned is that foundations and some other sort of traditional sources of funding are not actually interested in funding activism. They're interested in funding discussion, but not not necessarily not activism. So, really that would have to come from private funders. Farmed Out is mainly supported by individual donations. They're mainly from people we know. I get really excited if I get a donation to Farmed Out from somebody whose name I don't recognize. So, yeah, but I also want to say, like, you don't need that much money. All the research that I do, almost all the research that I do is unfunded. Now I'm at a university. I do get to take advantage of students here. So I get some free labor. But we have a small staff at Farmed Out. We do amazing work. We sometimes win against, multi-billion-dollar companies. I know there's many people, on here who are also doing really fantastic work. Money would be nice, but it is not necessary to fight corporations and to fight and to fight evil, even when the odds are really really bad. We can still make a great difference.